Welcome to the Therapist Thrival Guide. My name is Miranda Barker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I am here with Keith Myers. Keith, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, Miranda, thank you for having me. I'm Keith Myers. I am an Ellie Mental Health Clinic director in Marietta, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. And been working with Ellie now since October of last year. And we opened a clinic just this past March. And so just second quarter open. And so all the fun and new that brings. And traditionally before that, I've been in the clinical mental health field now for about 20 years and done a variety of different roles. I've worked in community mental health. I've worked in academia. I was a full-time professor and former dean for several number of years. And so really excited about being with Ellie, and have had a really good experience overall with Ellie the last several months. And so I've actually seen this podcast before. One of your podcasts with Aaron Pash, one of the co-founders of Ellie, and was really struck by it, really enjoyed it. So when you asked me to come on here, I was like, absolutely, this is the Thrival Guide. I know about this. So yeah.
Oh, that's so awesome. I love it. What's your licensure? Are you LPCC,
Yes.
something else?
I'm an LPC. In Georgia, it's called a licensed professional counselor. So LPC, fully licensed in Georgia. Yes.
Okay. And so what does a clinic director role look like?
Mm-hmm. How much time do we have?
No, for sure.
I thought my owners, the franchisee, Ellie franchisees who are my owners of the clinic, I thought they have a pretty good description. It's basically like, I run the business, and they definitely are making a lot of influential decisions as well. But like from day-to-day operations, I run the business, and so for our clinic, it was putting things in place with the building and furniture and all the logistics around that, which I really hadn't had any experience doing around franchise model and things like that. So that was all brand new for me. So I got a lot of fun new experiences with franchising, what that means, what it doesn't mean, but a lot of supervision of the clinicians that we have here, trainings, making sure that documentation is up to par, and being able to provide opportunities for networking for the clinicians to be able to build their caseloads, being real visible in the community and letting the community know about the Ellie Mental Health brand and what it means. There's a lot of different pieces that interpersonally, but also professionally. So there's some different pieces in there.
Awesome. How many clinicians do you supervise, or how many clinicians are at your clinic?
Right now, we have 3 full-time clinicians that are seeing clients, and we're about to hire a 4th. So we're still small, but we are definitely big in heart, and we are definitely we're definitely on the upward trend. We got a lot of new clients that are scheduling in the last month or two, and so I think this fall will be a real big need for us. Yeah.
That's awesome. Oh, that's awesome. Well, thanks for joining. I have to say, I think we've interacted on like LinkedIn or social media a couple of different times. And so I'm very familiar with your name. And then I saw a LinkedIn post that you posted recently around kind of suicide prevention awareness. And it's September. It's Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. And so wanted to have you on the podcast to talk a little bit more about your experience with this topic, your story, and then kind of what some new clinicians or therapists can take away from that. And so if you don't mind, can we jump right in and you can tell me a little bit about
Let's just do it.
Kind of what that post was about? And yeah, tell me.
Yeah. So this post, the post on LinkedIn last week, I guess it was, or week before, and it was basically highlighting just that I had about 4 years ago, I had a supervisee who I was pretty close with. I had actually been her supervisor through internship. And so even while she was a master's student, and then she continued with me in her post-grad work. As I was reflecting on an article that I was writing, is getting ready to come out for Counseling Today, which is our counseling magazine through ACA, American Counseling Association. It's coming out in September for Suicide Awareness Month. And as I was reflecting on our time together, we had spent over 100 hours together clinically in supervision. And long story, but making it shorter for a podcast, I guess. But I experienced a loss where my supervisee died by suicide, and for me, that was unfathomable. Like, I didn't know anybody that was a supervisor that lost anybody through suicide. I didn't envision that for myself or expect that I would, even though I intellectually know, right, that suicide's a real issue, and for different reasons, right? So I intellectually knew that, but emotionally, it was like I was confronted with something that I really hadn't dreamed of happening to my supervisees or to myself. So that was a big blow. For a number of days after, was very in trauma survival mode. Just like I was saying with our clients, they go through a traumatic event, and it was really intense. And so kind of went through that process, and definitely some things I learned across the way. So I'd been writing this article on and off for like 2 years, which was it rolled out of my journal reflections that I was writing about my experience with this loss. And so the journal had finally accepted my article, was ready to be published for September Suicide Awareness Month. And so that's what led to the LinkedIn post. So a little bit of background there.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that background. Tell me a little bit more about what this article is about. How did you cope immediately after this loss? And those might be kind of two different questions, but
Sure.
Sure. I'd love to hear more about this.
Yeah. So I think for me, it was, and I mentioned this a little bit in the article, but, for me, like I can recall being at, the memorial service for this person that I'd lost. And I remember me sitting there kind of and thinking about, almost in a reflective, meditative state of mind, what am I going to learn from this? How am I going to be different? And I remember it's almost like this internal conversation, right, that I had with myself, like a different part of me, the emotional part of me saying, you need to table this. You need to allow yourself to feel. You need to allow yourself to feel the loss from this. You need to allow yourself to grieve this before you make any kind of grand conclusions about what it means. And so for me, it was allowing my emotional self free reign and feeling everything that I needed to feel for a significant period of time. And that was important for me. So that's one of the things immediately that I did, was allowing myself to really fully grieve and feel the loss.
How were you able to? I mean, I know that everybody grieves differently, but
Sure.
How did you feel like you were able to process this or grieve this huge loss?
Yeah, I think the first thing I did, there's definitely a few things that I can reflect back now, and I can know that I did these things, and they were helpful for me, is allowing myself to feel without judgment. There's a host of emotions that I felt: sad, angry, hurt, betrayed, guilty, empathy, all these things that I felt for myself, but also for my supervisee. And so I think allowing myself to feel those things without having a lot of extra mental script that come with that, right? And without having a lot of judgment from that. I also sought support from other people, whether that be my therapist at the time. I remember, scheduling some additional therapy sessions. And I think that was really important for me. Being able to take time for solitude. So be able to get away from work, to be able to get away from some of my normal responsibilities as a father, as a husband, as a clinician, I think was really important too. So being able to get away, being able to engage in prayer for me personally was helpful. I read a couple of books about grieving a suicide, which was really helpful. And so those are some of the things that I now can look back and know that I did as a way to allowing that emotional part of me to be able to feel the grief fully.
Mm-hmm. How did you keep yourself from kind of blaming or feeling some of the guilt around maybe like not seeing signs or not talking. I mean,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think as therapists, we take so much responsibility for our clients or our supervisees' well-being. How are you able to kind of give yourself a break from some of that?
Right. That's a good question. It's a fair point. And I guess that does assume that I didn't feel guilt. And so I think, frankly, there were times when, because I can look back and I can say, like, hey, I think I've been better about traditionally as a clinician, as you know, a, a therapist with clients. I've been good about like attaching to the person and detaching from their outcome. But with a supervisee, definitely feeling an enhanced level of responsibility professionally for their development. It was easy for me to wonder about, right? Like, what could I have done differently? And there's a part of me that really feels like that's just a human reaction to something really hard that happens, right? And traumatic. There's a very much an evaluation or reevaluation of what took place and what's my part in that or what was not my part in that. So there's a part of that I kind of understand. And there's a searching, right? That kind of goes, at least for me, there was like a searching of like, well, what about this? And what about when that happened? And how did I handle that? And so, yeah, I think there was a season of that where it was like I was asking really hard questions of myself. And I said, ultimately, being committed to not judging myself and ultimately not judging my supervisee too for the decision that she made, I think was really important for me and my healing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes so much sense. I think that um, this is something that I see a lot of therapists kind of ask questions around, particularly around like if they lose a client to suicide or
Yes. Yes. And I've lost a
and
few
I
of
think
those.
it's oh, you have.
I have.
How was that grieving process different or similar?
Yeah, I think it's similar in that in the way I look at therapy is like it's kind of sacred ground to me. Like it's kind of there's a spiritual component of like sitting with clients and their suffering that you don't typically get anywhere else. So like for me, I really place the experience in a spiritual kind of sense. Um, and so when that happens, it'll lose a client. I think there's a part of me um, that feels a lot of empathy for my client. And I tend to lead with empathy in most cases, and I'm getting better at leading empathy with myself. But even though that's been a work, that's taken longer to do. But I think leading empathy with clients definitely sets that part where I can be able to say, yeah, that person was definitely in a hopeless place, or that person was definitely in a place where they didn't see a way out, and trying to understand it from that perspective, from the place of empathy. When I have judgment, or when I have opinions, or when I take leaps in thinking right about certain situations, that tends to lead me more towards I guess being resentful towards clients or my supervisee. So I think for me, it's leading with empathy for the person, and that really tends to get me in a good place where I can accept what happened, and then just think acknowledging the hard.
Mhm. You mentioned that you were able to go to your supervisee's memorial service. I imagine that was probably, I think going to memorial services can be so helpful for closure. I mean, not even closure, but just the
Yeah,
grieving process.
right.
What what about when you lose a client? Are you able to go to their memorial service? Is that appropriate? Did you
That's a
go?
good
I'm
question.
curious.
That's a good question. I've never been to a memorial service for my client. So I never had that, that more formal ritual around loss and grief. And there was one client when um, that I had the opportunity to go, because there are other situations
Mm.
I didn't know was happening or didn't have news of it. But there was one client I had the opportunity to go, and I really thought long and hard about that. Um,
Yeah.
and ultimately, I decided not to go, simply because there was going to be a number of people there that I knew, and
Mm.
still trying to protect the privacy of the client, even though the client had passed. So that's ultimately the
Yeah.
decision I made. But that's a
Mhm.
fair question. I certainly wouldn't feel, judgment necessary for somebody that wanted to go to a client's memorial.
Mhm.
There are ways that you can still make that private, probably. But it does create this kind of
Mm.
ethical dilemma. Um,
Right,
you
right.
know,
Because confidentiality
right,
continues even after a client dies. And so, um, you know, putting yourself into a position where you're going to a funeral and then someone's saying, well, how did you know the person that passed away?
right,
And
right,
then not being able to say, well, I was their therapist, or
right.
um, that's tricky. That's a question that I see on a lot of like therapists forums and things, because I think culturally going to memorial services is a really important way that we grieve. And
Yes,
if we feel like we're not able to do that for um, a client, then certainly needing to think of other ways that you can memorialize them, or think about
right.
their memory or grieve
Yeah,
that. It's an
yeah, that's a
interesting
great. And I've
dilemma.
seen, coming off the heels of COVID, I've seen some that have the online component. So like that might be if
Mm,
people are still
that's
doing
true.
that, having that factor in there, they might be able to do that more anonymously, by not being
That's a good
physically
point.
present. But I
Hmm.
don't see them as much anymore than I did maybe a couple of years ago. But that would be
Yeah,
a good alternative, maybe, if you could make that happen. But yeah, that's
sure.
so. Yeah, thinking about culturally and how we grieve, and
Hmm.
yeah, thinking about that. But yeah, definitely journaling. That's definitely helped me be able to reflect. Has been a good tool too, to be able to reflect
I
about.
appreciated, yeah, I mean, and I appreciate that you had said, you know, you wanted to jump straight into like, what can I learn from this, or what
Yeah,
can I take from this? And I think
that's
that's
the
such a
teacher in me.
human,
Yeah,
right? Well,
when you have
I would
some,
feel the same way.
yeah,
Hmm. Because even as a therapist, you're thinking to yourself like, um, how can I prevent this from happening again? What can I learn from this?
prevention,
And
prevention,
I
right?
think,
Yeah,
yeah, and I think I'm so glad that you were able to kind of stop yourself and say, no, I need to grieve through this. I need to allow myself to feel this emotion before I just immediately go into like problem solving. How am I going to do that? How am I going to fix this sort of mode?
yeah, and I think that
Several,
taught me a lot too. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Miranda.
no, go ahead. Yeah.
That taught me a lot
Tell
about
me more.
myself
Yeah.
too, right? Of like even just asking that question and then having my emotional part saying, I need more space. Taught me that I tend to start with my cognition, my intellect, right? Really hard things happen. I tend to lean that way, and my emotional part tends to have a back seat. I mean, so by me allowing myself to be able to feel and to be able to have the emotional part as primary in the driver's seat, so to speak, um, really allowed me to have a different experience. And so I
Hmm.
think that's taught me a lot about myself that probably wouldn't have happened before, in that I need to allow my emotional part to come forward more often. And so for me, that was a great takeaway, just for my own self and my own growth. And so that's in and of itself, that's a lesson, right? Even though I didn't in the moment thinking like, hey, let's stop thinking about the grand
Hmm.
lessons I'm going to take away from this, and let this
Yeah.
emotional part of myself be more prominent. In and of itself
Hmm.
was a lesson. Even in the moment, I didn't
Did
realize
you take, yeah, did you take any time off or time
I
from
did.
clients, or
Did.
you did? Okay.
Yeah, I took a few days off, to solitude, and got away, and then
Good.
I did take. I think it was about a week and a half, or so, from seeing clients. One could probably
Mm,
argue could have taken more time, but that's the time I took. Yeah,
good. Yeah, I'm glad. That's good. So several years have passed now.
yeah, it's been
Um,
4 years. Yeah.
yeah. So what do you feel like are some like lessons that you've been able to glean from this, or how do you think that you practice differently after going through some of these experiences?
Well, I think I mentioned some lessons earlier about the like how to cope and being in
Mm-hmm.
therapy and seeking support from others and letting yourself feel without judgment, those types of things. I think one other thing that has been helpful for me is to try to find you know a metaphor or a quote or something that really expresses deep meaning with it, so that I can kind of resonate with that and kind of you know let me see that in a new light. Um, and so for me, I think over the years, um, there's been a quote that's kept coming up for me, whether it be the way that my therapist asked me a certain question about how I'm grieving in the middle of this or not, or maybe just other like observations.
Mm-hmm.
Is what is grief if love not persisting?
Mm-hmm.
So that for me resonates, just in the care that I have, for my supervisee and all my supervisees and clients, is that at least I like to think of myself as like caring well for people,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a quote that has definitely, or a question that has definitely resonated with me, and that's kind of how I think of my process.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's powerful. Can you say it one more time? I want to hear it again.
Sure, sure, sure. What is grief if love not persisting?
Yeah, that's powerful because it is. I mean, you care for this person, and your care doesn't just go away
Right.
when they pass. And so, no, I appreciate you sharing that.
Of course. Yeah.
How do you think that you approach conversations around suicide, or if a client or a supervisee were to tell you that they were experiencing some suicidal ideation, um, how do you approach those conversations? Does it, having lost people, like, do you think it puts you more on edge, or do you
Mhm.
think it helps you kind of be able to navigate some of those conversations differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, and this is where I think what resonates with me personally also resonates with me professionally, and working with Ellie Mental Health and being able to crush the stigma of mental health, is that like how I engage with people now around the topic of suicide in the general public. Um, it's like I've got this like super tuned in radar around suicide myths. Um,
Mm,
and so, like, if somebody mentions a myth or someone kind of, in the general public, right? So it's like making a comment about suicide being selfish. The person, oh,
mhm,
this is the most selfish act anybody could do. So it's like you start hearing those kind of beliefs,
yeah,
right? They kind of creep in.
mhm,
Or like, I'm not going to talk to that person because that's going to send them over the edge. When we know the opposite is actually helpful and true, and the opposite is true. The more likely you are to ask somebody about it, the less likely they are to attempt. So I think,
yeah,
so being able to kind of lean into some of those myths around suicide for me has been helpful, and to have conversations where maybe in the past I would have just let that go and I wouldn't have
hmm,
challenged it, or I wouldn't have said like, hey, well, let's talk about that more. I wouldn't have leaned into it.
mhm.
Um, Whereas now I'm leaning into those conversations and I'm able to have the harder conversations with folks to challenge some of those assumptions.
Oh, that's so good. No, that's great. And I think this is something that like newer clinicians are really afraid of. I don't feel like
Yes.
graduate school really prepared me well to talk about suicide with clients. I don't feel like I think that what has ultimately helped me is exactly what you're saying, like leaning into some of those conversations and just asking questions and exploring and saying, um, well, let me stop you right there. Like, what do you mean by that? Or, and just trying to have some natural curiosity around it. Um, when you have conversations with clients or supervisees, do you typically then like come up with a safety plan? Like, what are kind of the steps that you take when you're exploring some of these feelings?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And that is, something I did, even with even with the loss that I had. It was like being able to
Hmm.
say, let's come up with a safety plan when you're having these kind of thoughts. And who can you reach out to? Who can you talk to? What are some things you can do to feel different, to feel less hopeless? So I think definitely having some sort of conversation about, what's the plan when you get to this point,
Hmm.
or maybe even not till you get to this point, right? What's the plan 2 steps before this point, is really helpful. And I think definitely identifying support systems and things like that, and resources, obviously, that could be available at a 3 a.m. When somebody's having these kind of thoughts, really important.
How have you? How does this topic of suicide typically come up for you with clients or with supervisees? Like, is
Well, I
it
typically
that
ask
you're?
them in the beginning. I typically will say, as a part of my intake, have you ever thought about killing
Mm,
yourself, or have you ever had a time where you attempted to kill yourself? Like, I tend to work it into my intakes, and I train my clinicians to do the same, and to be able to assess from the beginning, um, knowing that not everybody's going to have that experience, and so it won't be necessarily something that comes up every session. But for other clients, it
mhm,
might be something that comes up, most sessions or every session, depending on their history, with suicidal thoughts, and or suicidal attempts. So that's something
mhm.
we start out here at my clinic. Is like we work it in our intake,
You just make it a part of your normal,
right?
questions, and
Right.
that makes sense. I find too that like when it has come up with clients for me, most typically it's been around um, if they're doing like a new PHQ-9, we're talking about treatment planning, or like some of those natural times where you're evaluating progress. And in the PHQ-9, it even asks about like, have you had any thoughts of suicide or harming yourself? And um, I found that like top clients are typically pretty honest if I have rapport built with them at that point, and then we're kind of talking about it. But I struggle with just bringing it up in like everyday sessions,
Yeah. 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 How do you create that
but
awkward conversation, right? Like, how do you lean into that? Yeah, and I,
yeah.
I I will sometimes tell clients, and this is a good reminder for me to do it every time. But in intakes, like, say, like, there may be times when I bring this up again, um,
Mm,
depending on what you got going on. There may be conversations we have in the future where I ask about it again and how you're doing that day, right? Because how you're doing
mhm.
now and how you've done the last 5 years, may or may not be how you're doing any 3 months from now or a year from now, because
Yeah.
life changes and we all go through things, and then how we feel about ourselves, or what we believe or what we think changes. So that I
Mhm.
kind of preempt that sometimes, where it's like, hey, I'm going to have these conversations again, just so that the client
You're
is
ready.
not totally
Mhm.
blindsided by it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll just kind
Yeah.
of make
No,
a
that's good.
I'll kind of make a light of it. And you got to know you got to be careful with this, because you got to know your client. There's
Uh-huh.
definitely some clients I would not make light of with suicide, but I might say something like, and now's the time when I ask you a really awkward therapist question. um, are you having suicidal thoughts today? So, like,
Yeah.
I know my clients that I can do that with, and I know my clients I can't
Mhm.
do that with. So
No, that's good.
yeah, don't leave this podcast saying, hey, joking about asking about suicide. But I think for some clients,
Mhm.
incorporating the humor into one of core values of Ellie, right? Of like injecting humor
Mhm.
into really intense conversation can sometimes be regulating for clients and
Oh,
therapists.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and it makes it feel less of like a big scary question that you're asking. It's like
Right.
a, "Hey, I'm human. I'm asking you this." And no, I think that's good. That's good. Any other last thoughts or kind of advice or things that we feel like we haven't touched on yet?
Um, no, I mean, the only thing I would say is, like, um, I've asked a lot of people that I know, like, and none of them have had a supervisee suicide loss, but I know it's out there. I know people experience it. So, like,
Mhm.
if you're watching this podcast and you want to reach out to me, you feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email, give me a call. Like, I'd be happy to chat with you about it. So I just want to put that out
That's
there
awesome.
to people who are listening and watching this.
No, that's powerful. Finding support and being able to lean on one another when you're going through these things is super important. I will put I guess I'll put my email address in the chat,
Yeah,
and if people want to reach out, then they can
yeah,
certainly, I'll
absolutely.
connect you with Keith. But yeah, also, I wanted to say too, when that article comes out, please share
Mhm.
it with me and I'll put it in the description as well because I'm
Oh,
so
yeah, we'll do
excited to
that.
read it. And
Yeah.
I just really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience and um, yeah, and just sharing how you got through this and yeah, I just appreciate you a lot, Keith. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you so much, Miranda. And I will definitely do that about the article. And yeah, definitely let's stay in touch.
Awesome.